There are voices that should never be silenced. In the autumn of 1873, residents of a small township near the Hudson River Valley began noticing something peculiar. The grand estate of Baron Heinrich von Strauss, a wealthy Austrian immigrant who had purchased the old Vandermeer mansion 3 years prior, had become eerily quiet. No more evening gatherings. No more carriages arriving for elaborate dinners. The servants who once gossiped freely at the local market now hurried through their errands in silence, their eyes downcast. But it was the music, or rather the absence of it, that truly disturbed those who remembered. The Baron had been known throughout the region for his obsession with opera, hosting performances that drew audiences from as far as New York City. Then, without explanation, the music stopped. Or rather, it didn't stop. It simply vanished behind the mansion's thick stone walls, where only the Baron could hear the voice that had once captivated hundreds. What happened within those walls would not be discovered until a brutal winter storm in 1876 forced open secrets that powerful men had worked desperately to keep buried. Before we continue with the story of Baron von Strauss,
make sure you are subscribed to Circle of Fire 1.
Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? Now let's uncover what really happened in that mansion on the Hudson. The township of Rhinecliff, New York in 1873 was a place caught between two worlds. The old Dutch families who had settled the region 2 centuries earlier still maintained their stone houses and their quiet Presbyterian ways. But the new money, railroad barons, steel magnates, European nobility fleeing political upheaval, was transforming the landscape. Grand estates sprouted along the river like mushrooms after rain, each more ostentatious than the last. The Vandermeer mansion had stood empty for nearly a decade after old Cornelius Vandermeer died without heirs in 1863. Its Gothic revival architecture and sprawling grounds, a reminder of faded glory. The house itself was a monument to an earlier era of wealth with its pointed arches, elaborate stonework, and a tower that rose above the tree line like a warning finger pointed at the sky. When Baron Heinrich von Strauss purchased the property in 1870 for the substantial sum of $45,000, the locals were cautiously optimistic. The Baron, a man in his late 50s with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and a meticulously groomed beard that reached nearly to his chest, claimed to be minor Austrian nobility who had made his fortune in the timber trade throughout the forests of Bohemia and Moravia. He spoke English with a thick accent that some found charming and others found affected, rolling his R's and emphasizing unexpected syllables in a way that made even simple statements sound portentous. He was generous with the local tradesmen, paying his bills promptly and in gold coin, rather than the banknotes that many distrusted in those uncertain post-war years. He paid his servants well, considerably better than the going rate, and seemed genuinely interested in becoming part of the community, attending church services at the Dutch Reformed congregation and making substantial donations to the local orphanage. But it was his passion for music that truly defined him in the eyes of Rhinecliff society. The Baron had spent what locals estimated to be another $20,000 renovating the mansion's ballroom, a cavernous space on the ground floor that had once hosted the region's most elegant gatherings. He installed acoustical panels imported from Vienna, crafted from special woods that he claimed had been aged for decades to achieve perfect resonance. He brought in craftsmen from New York City to build a stage that could accommodate a small orchestra, with special flooring designed to enhance the sound of footsteps and create the illusion that performers were larger than life. The ceiling was repainted with elaborate frescoes depicting scenes from classical mythology: Apollo and the Muses, Orpheus charming the beasts with his lyre, all executed by an Italian artist who spent 6 months living at the estate. The Baron hired musicians from New York City and even from as far as Boston and Philadelphia, paying them handsomely to make the journey to Rhinecliff and perform for his guests. He hosted monthly performances that became the social event of the season, sending out engraved invitations on heavy cream-colored paper embossed with his family crest, a somewhat suspicious detail, as some of the older families quietly noted that the crest bore no resemblance to any known Austrian noble house. But such concerns were easily overlooked when one received an invitation to hear a string quartet from the New York Philharmonic or a pianist who had studied under Franz Liszt himself. Families would travel for hours to attend these performances, dressed in their finest clothes, the women in silk gowns with bustles and the men in formal evening wear. They would arrive in carriages that lined the long drive leading up to the mansion, their horses stamping and snorting in the cool evening air. The Baron himself would greet each guest personally at the door, bowing over the ladies' hands with old-world courtesy and engaging the gentlemen in conversation about politics, business, and the arts. He was an excellent host, attentive without being obsequious, knowledgeable without being pedantic. The Baron would often introduce the performers himself, standing on the stage with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. He would speak eloquently about the emotional power of music, about how it could transport the soul to realms beyond the mundane concerns of daily life, about how the great composers had understood something fundamental about the human condition that could not be expressed in mere words. His eyes would shine with an intensity that some found inspiring and others found unsettling, a fervor that seemed almost religious in its devotion. He spoke of music as if it were a living thing, something that could be possessed and hoarded, something precious that must be protected from those who could not properly appreciate it. After the performances, the Baron would host elaborate dinners, with multiple courses served on china imported from Dresden, and wine from his personal cellar that he claimed had been laid down by his grandfather. The conversations at these dinners ranged widely: politics, philosophy, the latest scientific discoveries, the ongoing reconstruction of the South, the scandals involving the Grant administration. The Baron was well informed on all these topics, though he tended to steer conversations back to music whenever possible. He had strong opinions about which composers were truly great and which were merely popular, about the proper way to interpret a Beethoven sonata or a Mozart aria. Some guests found his certainty refreshing, others found it domineering. In the spring of 1873, the Baron made an announcement that sent ripples of excitement through the community. He had discovered, he said, a soprano of extraordinary talent, a young woman whose voice rivaled the great European opera singers. Her name was Margherita Bellini, and she was, according to the Baron, the daughter of an Italian composer who had fallen on hard times after the unification of Italy had disrupted the old patronage systems. The Baron had encountered her singing in a church in New York City. He did not specify which church, and no one thought to ask, and had been so moved that he had immediately offered to become her patron. He would provide her with room and board at his estate, along with the finest vocal training, in exchange for exclusive performances for his guests. It was, he insisted, an arrangement that would benefit everyone. Margherita would have the opportunity to develop her craft without the vulgar commercialism of the public stage, where singers were forced to perform night after night until their voices were ruined, and his guests would have the privilege of hearing a voice that would one day be celebrated throughout the world. The arrangement, as the Baron described it, was not unusual for the time. Wealthy patrons had long supported promising artists, providing them with the financial security necessary to perfect their craft. What was perhaps unusual was the exclusivity of the arrangement. Margherita would perform only at the Baron's estate, only for his invited guests. But the Baron had a ready explanation for this as well. The young woman was shy, unaccustomed to large public audiences, and needed time to develop her confidence and stage presence in a more intimate setting. It all sounded perfectly reasonable. The first performance was scheduled for May 15, 1873. Nearly 200 people crowded into the Baron's ballroom that evening, the air thick with anticipation, and the scent of imported perfumes mingling with the smell of beeswax candles that illuminated the space. The audience included not just the local gentry, but also visitors from New York City, music critics, opera enthusiasts, and society figures who had heard rumors of this extraordinary new talent. The Baron had spared no expense, hiring a small orchestra to accompany Margarita and decorating the ballroom with elaborate floral arrangements that must have cost a small fortune. When Margarita Bellini finally stepped onto the stage, a collective gasp rippled through the audience. She was younger than many had expected, perhaps 22 or 23, with dark hair piled high on her head in an elaborate style that emphasized her long, graceful neck. She wore a simple white gown that seemed almost austere compared to the elaborate fashions of the other women present, but the simplicity only served to highlight her natural beauty. But it was her face that captured attention, pale as alabaster, with high cheekbones that caught the candlelight, a full mouth that seemed made for singing, and large dark eyes that seemed to hold both sadness and defiance. There was something haunting about her appearance, something that suggested depths of emotion that most people spent their lives trying to conceal. Then she began to sing. The aria was from Verdi's La Traviata, Sempre Libera, the famous coloratura showcase that concludes the first act. And from the first note, it was clear that the Baron had not exaggerated. Margarita's voice was extraordinary, rich and powerful in the lower register, yet capable of the most delicate pianissimo passages in the upper range. It soared through the ballroom with a purity that seemed almost otherworldly, each phrase perfectly shaped, each ornament executed with precision and taste. The coloratura passages, those rapid runs and trills that separate great sopranos from merely good ones, were flawless, her voice moving through the difficult intervals with an ease that made them sound simple. She sang of love and loss, of freedom and constraint, of joy and despair, and the audience sat transfixed, some with tears streaming down their faces, others with their mouths slightly open in wonder. The technical mastery was impressive, but it was the emotional depth that truly distinguished her performance. When she sang of Violetta's desperate desire for freedom, for a life lived on her own terms, there was something in her voice, a quality of genuine longing that transcended mere performance. It was as if she were not singing a character's emotions, but her own, as if the aria were not a piece of theatrical entertainment, but a personal confession. Those who had heard the great European sopranos, Adelina Patti, Christine Nilsson, Clara Louise Kellogg, would later say that Margarita's voice was the equal of any of them, and perhaps superior in its emotional authenticity. When the final note faded into silence, there was a long moment before the applause began, as if everyone needed time to return from wherever her voice had taken them, as if they needed to remember that they were sitting in a ballroom in upstate New York and not in some transcendent realm where only beauty existed. Then the applause erupted, thunderous and sustained, with many people rising to their feet. Men shouted, "Brava!" and women waved their handkerchiefs. The ovation lasted for several minutes, and Margarita stood on the stage, her hands clasped in front of her, accepting the acclaim with a series of graceful curtsies. The Baron stood at the side of the stage, his face flushed with what appeared to be pride and possessiveness in equal measure. He applauded longer and louder than anyone else, his eyes never leaving Margarita's face, watching her with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. She curtsied gracefully, but those closest to the stage would later recall that she did not smile, not once during the entire ovation. And when she looked out at the audience, her eyes seemed to be searching for something, or someone, that she did not find. There was a quality of desperation in that searching gaze, quickly masked but unmistakable to those who noticed it. After the performance, during the social hour that followed, the Baron kept Margarita close to his side, his hand frequently resting on her elbow or the small of her back, in a gesture that could have been protective or possessive depending on one's interpretation. Several music critics from New York attempted to interview her, asking about her training, her background, her future plans. The Baron answered most of the questions himself, explaining that Margarita had studied with the great Italian pedagogue Francesco Lamperti in Milan, that her father had been a composer of some renown who had written several operas that had been performed at La Scala, that she had come to America seeking new opportunities after her mother's death had left the family in difficult financial circumstances. Margarita herself said very little, offering only brief confirmations of the Baron's statements. When one persistent critic asked her directly about her interpretive choices in the aria, she began to answer, her face brightening slightly as she spoke about the character of Violetta and the tragedy of a woman trapped by society's expectations. But the Baron interrupted, placing his hand on her shoulder and saying smoothly, "Miss Bellini must preserve her voice. Talking too much after a performance can strain the vocal cords. I'm sure you understand, gentlemen." The critics nodded and moved away, though more than one of them noted in their subsequent reviews that the young soprano seemed strangely reticent, almost withdrawn, despite the brilliance of her performance. Over the following months, Margarita performed regularly at the Baron's estate, once or twice a month, always on a Saturday evening, always to a packed ballroom. Each performance was more spectacular than the last, with the Baron continually expanding the repertoire and hiring larger orchestras to accompany her. She sang arias from all the major Verdi operas, Il Trovatore, Rigoletto, Un ballo in maschera, Don Carlo, as well as selections from Donizetti, Bellini, and Mozart. The Baron seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of sheet music, much of it rare editions that he claimed to have brought from Europe. Invitations to the Baron's musical evenings became highly coveted throughout the Hudson Valley and beyond. To have attended one of Margarita's performances became a mark of cultural sophistication, something to be mentioned casually in conversation as proof of one's refined taste. The Baron was selective about whom he invited, seeming to prefer those who demonstrated genuine appreciation for music over those who merely sought social advancement. This selectivity only increased the desirability of the invitations. But as summer turned to autumn, some of the regular attendees began to notice subtle changes in Margarita's appearance and demeanor. She appeared thinner with each performance, her cheekbones becoming more prominent, her collarbones visible above the necklines of her gowns. There were dark circles under her eyes that even the most skillful application of powder could not entirely conceal. Her skin, which had been pale but healthy in May, now had a translucent quality, as if she was slowly fading away. She moved more slowly, more carefully, as if conserving her energy for the performance itself. Her performances, while still technically flawless, seemed to have lost some of their emotional depth. The passion that had made her debut so memorable had been replaced by something else, a mechanical perfection that was impressive but somehow hollow. She hit every note, executed every ornament, observed every dynamic marking, but the sense of personal investment, of genuine emotion, had diminished. It was as if she were going through the motions, fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing something from her soul. She rarely spoke to the guests during the social hour that followed each performance, and when she did, her responses were brief and formal, delivered in a soft voice that seemed to come from far away. She would stand beside the Baron, her posture perfect but rigid, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes downcast. The Baron, meanwhile, had become increasingly possessive, hovering near her constantly, interrupting any conversation that lasted more than a few moments, steering her away from anyone who showed too much interest in her background or her plans for the future. Mrs. Catherine Brennan, the wife of a prominent local merchant and one of the more perceptive members of Rhinecliff society, attempted to befriend Margarita after a performance in early September. She approached the young soprano with genuine warmth, complimenting her voice and asking about her background in Italy, about what it had been like to study in Milan, about whether she missed her family. Margarita had begun to respond, her face brightening slightly, a hint of animation returning to her features as she spoke about her younger brother Giovanni, who had also studied music and hoped to become a tenor, and about her mother, who had died of consumption 2 years earlier. But before she could say more, the Baron appeared at her elbow, seemingly materializing out of nowhere. "Miss Bellini tires easily," he said smoothly, his hand gripping Margarita's arm just above the elbow, with enough force that Mrs. Brennan could see his knuckles whiten. "She must preserve her voice. Singing takes a tremendous toll on the body, as I'm sure you understand. She needs rest and quiet." His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, a warning that Mrs. Brennan recognized from her years of navigating social situations. Mrs. Brennan nodded and stepped back, but not before she caught Margarita's eye. What she saw in that brief moment would trouble her for weeks afterward. A flash of desperation, of pleading, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. It was the look of someone drowning, reaching out for help but unable to speak. Mrs. Brennan would later tell her husband that she had seen that look before, in the eyes of women trapped in abusive marriages, women who had learned that asking for help only made things worse. The last public performance occurred on October 12, 1873. The program that evening included several arias from Verdi's operas, which had become Margarita's specialty. The Baron seemed to prefer Verdi above all other composers, and Margarita had developed a reputation as an exceptional interpreter of his music. But something was different that night. The audience, many of whom had attended multiple performances, could sense it even before Margarita took the stage. There was a tension in the air, a feeling of anticipation mixed with unease. Margarita appeared even more fragile than usual, her white gown hanging loosely on her frame, her face so pale that she seemed almost ghostly in the candlelight. She moved slowly across the stage, and when she took her position in front of the orchestra, she swayed slightly, as if dizzy. The Baron, watching from his usual position at the side of the stage, leaned forward, his expression intense and unreadable. The performance began well enough. Margarita sang arias from Rigoletto and Il Trovatore with her usual technical precision, though the emotional engagement that had characterized her earlier performances was almost entirely absent. She was going through the motions, hitting the notes but not inhabiting the characters. The audience applauded politely, but there was a sense of disappointment, a feeling that something essential was missing. The final aria of the evening was Addio del Passato from La Traviata, a song of farewell and resignation in which the dying Violetta reflects on her past and prepares for death. It is one of the most emotionally demanding arias in the soprano repertoire, requiring not just technical skill, but deep emotional vulnerability. As Margarita began to sing, something changed. The mechanical perfection fell away, and suddenly she was singing with all the passion and desperation that had been missing from the rest of the performance. It was as if she were not singing about Violetta's death, but about her own. As if she was saying goodbye to something precious that she knew she would never have again. The audience sat transfixed, many of them moved to tears by the raw emotion in her voice. But then, on a high note near the end of the aria, her voice broke. It was barely perceptible, a momentary crack in an otherwise perfect performance, a slight wavering of pitch that lasted perhaps half a second. Most of the audience didn't even notice it, but the Baron heard it. Those seated near him saw his face darken, saw his hands clench into fists, saw a muscle in his jaw begin to twitch. His eyes, fixed on Margarita, burned with an intensity that several people would later describe as frightening. It was not anger exactly, or at least not only anger. It was something more complex. Disappointment, possessiveness, a sense of betrayal, all mixed together into an expression that suggested violence barely held in check. When the performance ended and the guests began to depart, several people noticed that the Baron did not accompany them to the door, as was his custom. Instead, he remained in the ballroom with Margarita, and as the last carriage pulled away from the estate, those inside heard something that made them exchange uneasy glances. The sound of raised voices, one male and one female, coming from the mansion's upper floors. The Baron's voice was loud and harsh, though the words were indistinct. Margarita's voice was softer but clearly distressed, rising and falling in what sounded like pleading. The next day, the Baron's housekeeper, Mrs. Greta Hoffmann, a stern German woman in her mid-50s who had been with the Baron since his arrival in America, visited the local dressmaker with an unusual request. She needed several simple dresses made for Miss Bellini, she explained, but they must be made to very specific measurements, and they must have no buttons or fastenings that could not be easily managed by someone whose hands were occupied. The dresses should be loose-fitting, comfortable, suitable for wearing indoors for extended periods. No corsets, no elaborate undergarments, nothing that would require assistance to put on or take off. The dressmaker, Mrs. Sarah Whitlock, a widow who supported herself and her two daughters through her sewing, found the request odd but not alarming enough to refuse the business. Mrs. Hoffmann was offering to pay well, twice the usual rate, and Mrs. Whitlock needed the money. It was only later, when she reflected on the measurements Mrs. Hoffmann had provided, that she realized they suggested someone who had lost a considerable amount of weight in a very short time. The waist measurement in particular was alarmingly small, barely 20 inches, the size of a young girl rather than a grown woman. After that October performance, the musical evenings at the Baron's estate simply ceased. No announcement was made, no explanation offered. The Baron sent no more invitations, hired no more musicians, hosted no more dinners. When curious neighbors inquired, they were told that Miss Bellini had taken ill and required rest and quiet to recover her voice. The Baron himself was rarely seen in town, and when he did appear, he was brusque and distracted, conducting his business quickly and returning immediately to the estate. He no longer attended church services or social gatherings. He seemed to have withdrawn entirely from the community life that he had once embraced so enthusiastically. The servants, who had once been friendly and talkative, now seemed frightened. They completed their errands in silence and refused to answer questions about the household. When Mrs. Whitlock delivered the dresses to the estate, Mrs. Hoffmann met her at the door and took the package without inviting her inside, something that would have been considered extremely rude under normal circumstances. The housekeeper's face was drawn and tired, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she was not sleeping well. She paid Mrs. Whitlock in cash, counting out the bills with shaking hands, and closed the door without a word of thanks or farewell. Weeks turned into months. Winter arrived early that year, bringing heavy snows that isolated the grand estates along the river and made travel difficult. The Vandermeer mansion, perched on a hill overlooking the Hudson, became even more remote, its windows dark except for a single light that burned in the east tower every night from dusk until dawn. The light never wavered, never went out, burning with a steady, unwavering glow that some found comforting and others found ominous. Local children passing by on their way to school along the road that ran below the estate claimed they sometimes heard singing coming from that tower, a woman's voice, beautiful but sad, that seemed to float on the winter wind. They said the voice would sing the same phrases over and over, as if practicing or perhaps as if trapped in some kind of loop, unable to move forward. Their parents dismissed these stories as imagination, the kind of fanciful tales that children tell to make their walks to school more interesting. But some of the adults who lived closest to the estate admitted, in quiet conversations over tea or whiskey, that they too had heard something. Music that seemed to come and go like a ghost, never quite loud enough to identify but unmistakably present. A woman's voice singing scales and exercises and fragments of arias, always the same ones, repeated endlessly. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Rhinecliff intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. In the spring of 1874, a new housemaid was hired at the estate. Her name was Emma Kowalski, the daughter of Polish immigrants who had settled in the area to work on the railroad that was slowly extending its reach through the Hudson Valley. Emma was 17, strong from years of helping her mother with laundry and housework, and desperately needed the wages to help support her family. Her father had been injured in a railroad accident the previous year and could no longer work full-time, and her mother took in washing to make ends meet. The position at the Baron's estate, which paid $3 a week, plus room and board, was a godsend for the family. Mrs. Hoffman hired her to help with the heavy cleaning and laundry, warning her sternly during the interview that she was to work only on the ground floor and in the servants' quarters. Under no circumstances was she to venture to the upper floors or to the East Tower. The Baron, Mrs. Hoffman explained in her heavily accented English, valued his privacy absolutely, and any servant who violated this rule would be dismissed immediately without references, a threat that carried real weight in a time when a bad reference could make it impossible to find employment. Emma was a curious girl by nature, the kind of person who always wanted to know what was behind closed doors and around corners. But she was also practical and understood the precariousness of her family's situation. She needed this position, so she obeyed the rules scrupulously, keeping her eyes down and her questions to herself. She worked hard, scrubbing floors and washing windows and beating carpets until her arms ached. The work was exhausting, but it was no worse than what she had done at home, and the pay was better than anything else she could have found. But she could not help noticing certain things. 3 times a day, Mrs. Hoffman would prepare a tray of food and carry it upstairs herself, refusing any offer of help, even when the tray was heavy with dishes and covered serving plates. The trays that came back down were often barely touched, the food cold and congealed, as if whoever was eating it had no appetite, or perhaps was being forced to eat against their will. Emma also noticed that Mrs. Hoffman made frequent trips to the estate's small pharmacy, a locked cabinet in the butler's pantry, returning with bottles of laudanum and other medicines whose labels Emma could not read. And late at night, when Emma was supposed to be asleep in her small room off the kitchen, she would sometimes hear music, a woman singing scales and exercises, the same phrases repeated over and over, as if someone were practicing or perhaps being forced to practice. The voice was beautiful but somehow wrong, mechanical and lifeless, lacking the warmth and emotion that should characterize singing. It reminded Emma of the music boxes she had seen in shop windows, pretty but artificial, a simulation of life rather than life itself. One afternoon in June, while Mrs. Hoffman was in town purchasing supplies, Emma was cleaning the main hallway when she heard a sound that made her freeze, a woman's voice not singing but speaking, calling out in Italian. The voice came from somewhere above, muffled by walls and distance, but unmistakably desperate. Emma stood paralyzed, her heart pounding, the dust cloth forgotten in her hand. She knew she should ignore it, should continue with her work, should pretend she had heard nothing. But something in that voice, a quality of hopelessness that transcended language, compelled her to act. She climbed the main staircase, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet that ran down the center of the stairs. The upper hallway was dim, lit only by the afternoon sun filtering through heavy velvet drapes that had been drawn across the windows. The air smelled of dust and something else, something medicinal and slightly sweet that Emma could not identify. She followed the sound to a door at the end of the corridor, a heavy oak door with elaborate carving and an ornate brass lock that looked new, its metal still bright and unscratched. She pressed her ear against the door and heard the voice more clearly now, speaking rapidly in Italian. Words Emma could not understand, but whose meaning was clear. A plea for help, a desperate cry from someone in distress. The voice would speak for a few moments, then pause, then speak again, as if the speaker were gathering courage or perhaps waiting for a response that never came. Emma tried the handle. Locked. She knocked softly and whispered in English, "Hello? Are you all right?" The voice inside stopped abruptly. There was a long silence, during which Emma could hear her own heart beating and the distant sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the house. Then a response came in accented but clear English. "Who is there? Please, you must help me. I am locked in. I cannot." The voice broke off suddenly, and Emma heard another sound. Heavy footsteps on the stairs behind her, climbing rapidly, the tread of someone large and angry. She turned to find the Baron standing at the top of the staircase, his face dark with fury. He was breathing heavily, as if he had been running, and his eyes were wild, almost manic. In that moment, Emma understood that she had made a terrible mistake, that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low and dangerous, barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more frightening than if he had shouted. Emma stammered an excuse. She had heard a noise. She thought perhaps a window had broken. She was only trying to help. But the Baron was not listening. He advanced toward her, and Emma saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than his anger. A cold calculation, as if he were weighing options, considering solutions to a problem she represented. She could see him deciding what to do with her, see him considering possibilities that made her blood run cold. "You will leave this house immediately," he said, his voice still low but now carrying an edge of absolute command. "You will collect your things, and you will go, and you will tell no one what you heard here. If you speak of this to anyone at all, I will ensure that your father loses his position with the railroad. I have connections, girl. I know people in the railroad company, people who owe me favors. I can make certain that your entire family is blacklisted from employment throughout the region. Your father will never work again. Your family will starve. Do you understand me?" Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking. She fled down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste, grabbed her few possessions from her room, a spare dress, a hairbrush, a small Bible her mother had given her, and ran from the estate. She did not stop running until she reached her family's small house 2 miles away, her lungs burning and her legs aching. When her mother asked what had happened, why she was home in the middle of the day, why she was crying, Emma said only that the position had not suited her, that she had not been able to do the work to Mrs. Hoffman's satisfaction. She was too frightened to say more. The Baron's threat had been clear, and she knew that men of his wealth and position had the power to destroy families like hers with a word, with a letter, with a quiet conversation in the right office. But Emma could not forget that voice, that desperate plea for help. It haunted her dreams, waking her in the middle of the night with her heart racing and sweat soaking her nightgown. She would lie in the darkness, listening to her father's snoring from the next room and her younger siblings' quiet breathing, and she would think about the woman locked in that tower, alone and afraid, calling out for help that never came. The guilt ate at her, the knowledge that she had run away, that she had saved herself and left someone else to suffer. After several sleepless weeks, during which she grew pale and listless, and her mother began to worry that she was falling ill, Emma finally confided in Father Michael O'Brien, the priest at the local Catholic church. Father O'Brien was a young man, newly arrived from Ireland less than a year earlier, with a strong sense of justice and perhaps not yet fully aware of how power operated in places like Rhinecliff, where wealth could buy silence and influence could bury inconvenient truths. He was in his late 20s, with red hair and blue eyes, and a passion for social reform that had gotten him into trouble with his superiors back in Dublin. He listened to Emma's story with growing concern, his expression darkening as she described the locked door, the desperate voice, the Baron's threats. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes closed as if in prayer. Then he looked at her and said, "You did the right thing by coming to me. This is a serious matter, and it cannot be ignored. I will investigate, and I will do everything in my power to help whoever is being held in that house." Father O'Brien's first step was to visit the Baron's estate under the pretense of soliciting donations for the church's charity work, a common practice that gave him a legitimate reason to call on wealthy parishioners. He was received at the door by Mrs. Hoffman, who looked at him with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. When he explained the purpose of his visit, she told him curtly that the Baron was not at home and was not interested in receiving visitors or making donations. The Baron, she said, had his own charities that he supported and did not wish to be bothered by every priest and minister who came calling. Father O'Brien persisted, asking politely if he might leave some information about the church's work with the poor, perhaps some pamphlets that the Baron could review at his leisure. Mrs. Hoffman reluctantly agreed to take the materials, though it was clear she had no intention of actually giving them to the Baron. As Father O'Brien handed her the pamphlets, he mentioned casually that he had heard of Miss Bellini's beautiful voice and hoped she might be willing to perform at a church benefit concert that was being planned for the autumn. The church had a fine organ and excellent acoustics, he said, and it would be a wonderful opportunity for the community to hear such a talented singer in a sacred setting. Mrs. Hoffman's expression hardened. Her jaw tightened and her eyes narrowed, and when she spoke her voice was cold and final. "Miss Bellini is no longer in residence," she said firmly. "She returned to Italy to care for her ailing father. She left several months ago. Now, if you'll excuse me, Father, I have work to attend to." She closed the door in his face, not quite slamming it, but making it clear that the conversation was over. Father O'Brien left, but he was not satisfied. The housekeeper's reaction had been too defensive, too quick. If Margarita had simply returned to Italy, why would Mrs. Hoffman be so hostile to a simple inquiry? He made inquiries in town, speaking discreetly to merchants and other servants, asking casual questions about the Baron's household and whether anyone had seen Miss Bellini recently. What he learned troubled him deeply. No one had seen Margarita Bellini leave the estate. There had been no carriage to take her to the train station, no luggage loaded onto a wagon, no farewell to any of the people she had met during her months in Rhinecliff. For someone who had been such a prominent figure in the community, her departure had been remarkably quiet and unnoticed. Moreover, several people reported hearing singing from the mansion late at night, the same beautiful soprano voice that had once filled the Baron's ballroom. If Margarita had truly returned to Italy, whose voice was that? The Baron's explanation of a music box seemed increasingly implausible. The priest brought his concerns to Sheriff Thomas Brennan, Mrs. Catherine Brennan's husband, and the chief law enforcement officer in Rhinecliff. Sheriff Brennan was a practical man in his early 40s, cautious and aware of the political realities of his position. He had been sheriff for nearly 10 years, elected and re-elected because he understood how to maintain order without causing unnecessary trouble for the people who mattered, the wealthy landowners and businessmen who effectively controlled the town. The Baron was wealthy and influential, with friends in Albany and New York City. Men who could make life very difficult for a small-town sheriff who overstepped his bounds. Accusing such a man of wrongdoing based on the testimony of a dismissed housemaid and the suspicions of a young priest was dangerous. It could end Sheriff Brennan's career, could result in lawsuits and political pressure that would force him out of office. Nevertheless, Sheriff Brennan was not a corrupt man, and he took his responsibilities seriously. His wife had told him about her concerns regarding Margarita, about the look she had seen in the young woman's eyes, and he trusted his wife's judgment. He agreed to visit the estate and make some inquiries, though he warned Father O'Brien not to expect too much. The Baron received the sheriff with perfect courtesy, showing him into a well-appointed study lined with books and decorated with paintings of European landscapes. He offered brandy from a crystal decanter, which Sheriff Brennan declined, and listened with apparent patience as the sheriff explained that there had been some concern about Miss Bellini's welfare, that some people in town were worried about her sudden disappearance, that it would be helpful if the Baron could provide some clarification about her current whereabouts. The Baron smiled, a cold, controlled expression that did not reach his eyes. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I assure you it is misplaced. Miss Bellini did indeed return to Italy. Her father fell gravely ill, consumption, I believe, and she felt obligated to care for him. It was all very sudden, which is why there was no formal farewell. She received a telegram late one evening and departed the very next morning. I arranged for a private carriage to take her to the train station in Poughkeepsie, as I did not want her to have to wait for the regular coach. I have letters from her, if you would like to see them." He produced several letters from a drawer in his desk, written in Italian, in an elegant feminine hand, on expensive paper. The letters described life in a small village near Milan, mentioned her father's slowly improving health, expressed gratitude for the Baron's patronage and support, and hoped that she might return to America someday to resume her career. Sheriff Brennan, who could not read Italian and had no way of verifying whether the handwriting was actually Margarita's, examined them briefly and then handed them back. The letters looked authentic enough, and without evidence to the contrary, he had no reason to doubt them. "And the singing that people report hearing at night?" he asked, watching the Baron's face carefully for any sign of deception. The Baron's smile widened slightly, and he gestured to a corner of the study where a large wooden cabinet stood. "I have acquired a music box," he said, "a very fine one, imported from Switzerland. It plays recordings of operatic arias, not actual recordings, of course, but mechanical reproductions created by skilled craftsmen. The sound quality is quite remarkable. Perhaps that is what people are hearing. Sound carries strangely across the river valley, especially at night when everything else is quiet. I'm sure you're aware of that, Sheriff. A sound that originates here might seem to come from quite a different direction when heard from the road below." He opened the cabinet to reveal an elaborate music box, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship with a brass cylinder and delicate metal tines. He wound it up and set it playing, and the tinkling mechanical sound of an aria filled the room. It sounded nothing like a human voice, but Sheriff Brennan could imagine how, heard from a distance, muffled by walls and distorted by wind, it might be mistaken for singing. Sheriff Brennan had no grounds to push further. The Baron had a plausible explanation for everything, had shown no signs of nervousness or deception, and had even provided written evidence that Margarita had safely reached Italy. Without concrete evidence of a crime, without a witness who could testify to something more substantial than hearing a voice behind a locked door, there was nothing more he could do. He thanked the Baron for his time and left, feeling vaguely dissatisfied, but unable to articulate exactly why. Something about the interview had felt wrong, but he could not put his finger on what it was. He reported back to Father O'Brien that there appeared to be no cause for concern, that Miss Bellini had simply returned to Italy to care for her ailing father, that the Baron had letters proving this. The priest was not convinced, but without evidence, there was nothing more he could do. He prayed for Margarita's safety and for guidance. But he felt helpless, frustrated by his inability to help someone who might be in desperate need. The months that followed were quiet on the surface, but beneath that calm, several people continued to harbor doubts. Mrs. Catherine Brennan could not forget the look she had seen in Margarita's eyes that last evening, the flash of desperation that had been quickly suppressed. She mentioned her concerns to her husband repeatedly, but he had investigated and found nothing amiss. What more could he do? Emma Kowalski woke frequently from nightmares in which she heard that desperate voice calling for help, in which she stood outside that locked door, but could not make herself knock, could not make herself speak. And Father O'Brien, despite his youth and relative powerlessness, could not shake the conviction that something terrible was happening in the Baron's mansion, that a young woman was suffering while he stood by helplessly. In the autumn of 1874, a traveling opera company performed in Poughkeepsie, about 15 miles south of Rhinecliff. The company was touring through upstate New York, performing in small theaters and town halls, bringing culture to communities that rarely had the opportunity to hear professional opera. Father O'Brien, who tried to attend cultural events when his duties permitted, went to see one of the performances, a production of Donizetti's L'Elisir d'Amour. Among the performers was a tenor named Giovanni Rossetti, who sang the role of Nemorino with considerable skill and charm. After the performance, Father O'Brien approached him during the reception that followed, drawn by something familiar in the tenor's appearance: dark hair, dark eyes, high cheekbones. In halting Italian learned from his seminary studies, Father O'Brien asked if Rossetti had ever heard of a soprano named Margherita Bellini, daughter of a composer, who had supposedly returned to Italy to care for her ailing father. Rossetti's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face paled and he gripped Father O'Brien's arm with enough force to leave bruises. "Where did you hear that name?" he demanded in English, his accent thick but his words clear. "Where is she? Is she here? Is she alive?" When Father O'Brien explained about the Baron and the performances and Margherita's supposed return to Italy, Rossetti shook his head vehemently, his eyes filling with tears. "There is no Margherita Bellini," he said, his voice shaking. "That is not her real name. Her name is Margherita Santoro, and she was my sister. And she never returned to Italy. Our father is not ill. He is dead. He died 5 years ago. Whatever that man told you, it is a lie." Over the next hour, in a quiet corner of a tavern near the theater, Rossetti told Father O'Brien the truth. Margherita was not the daughter of a composer, but the daughter of a tailor from Naples, a skilled craftsman who had made suits for wealthy merchants and minor nobility. She had possessed an extraordinary voice from childhood, singing in the church choir and at family gatherings, and their parents had recognized her gift. They had sacrificed everything to give her musical training, paying for lessons with a local singing teacher, and later, when her talent became undeniable, sending her to study in Milan with one of the great pedagogues of the age. She had begun to build a reputation in Italian opera houses, singing small roles at first and then larger ones, earning praise from critics and audiences alike. She had been on the verge of a major breakthrough, about to be offered a contract at La Scala, when she met Baron Heinrich von Strauss, who was traveling through Italy in the spring of 1872. The Baron had attended a performance in which Margherita sang the role of Gilda in Verdi's Rigoletto, and he had been immediately obsessed with her voice and with her. He had come backstage after the performance and introduced himself, presenting his card and expressing his admiration in flowery language. Over the following weeks, he had attended every performance in which she sang, sending flowers to her dressing room and invitations to dinner. He had been charming and attentive, if somewhat intense, and Margherita had been flattered by the attention of a wealthy nobleman. When he offered her a contract to perform in America, promising fame and fortune, and the opportunity to sing for audiences who had never heard anything like her voice. She had been tempted. Her family had been hesitant. There was something about the Baron that made them uneasy, though they could not articulate exactly what it was. But the money he offered was extraordinary, more than Margherita could earn in 5 years of singing in Italian opera houses. And the opportunity to perform in America seemed like the chance of a lifetime. After much discussion and prayer, they had agreed. Margherita had sailed to America in early 1873, accompanied by the Baron. For the first few months, she had written regularly to her family, describing the performances and the beautiful estate and the enthusiastic audiences. Her letters had been cheerful and optimistic, full of plans for the future. But then, gradually, the tone had changed. The letters became shorter, less frequent, more guarded. She mentioned that the Baron was very demanding, that he insisted on being present for all her practice sessions, that he had strong opinions about how she should interpret various roles. She wrote that she felt isolated, that she missed her family and her friends, that she was homesick for Italy. The last letter they received in October 1873 had troubled the family deeply. Margherita wrote that she was well but tired, that the Baron was becoming increasingly controlling, that she was not allowed to leave the estate without his permission. She mentioned that he had become angry when she suggested performing in New York City for a wider audience, that he had told her that her voice was too precious to be wasted on the masses, that only a select few were worthy of hearing her sing. The letter ended with a sentence that had haunted Giovanni ever since. "Sometimes I feel that my voice is no longer my own, that it belongs to him, and I am merely the instrument through which it must pass. I am afraid, Giovanni. I do not know what to do." After that letter, there had been silence. The family had written repeatedly but received no response. They had sent telegrams, but these too went unanswered. Finally, in desperation, Giovanni had borrowed money from relatives and friends, had sold his few possessions, and had booked passage to America, determined to find his sister and bring her home. He had arrived in New York City 3 months earlier and had been searching for her ever since, performing with traveling opera companies to earn money while making inquiries at every theater and opera house, showing Margherita's photograph to anyone who might have seen her. He had finally traced her to Rhinecliff, but when he arrived in the town and began asking questions, he had been told that she had returned to Italy, which he knew to be a lie, because she had never arrived home, because their family had heard nothing from her in more than a year. He had been trying to figure out what to do, how to get access to the Baron's estate, how to find proof that his sister was being held against her will, when Father O'Brien had approached him. Father O'Brien felt a chill run down his spine as he listened to Giovanni's story. Everything suddenly made sense. The locked door, the desperate voice, the Baron's possessiveness, the implausible story about Margherita's return to Italy. He told Giovanni everything he knew. Emma's testimony, the locked door, the desperate voice, the Baron's threats, the letters supposedly from Margherita that were almost certainly forgeries. Giovanni listened with growing horror and rage, his hands clenching into fists, his face flushing red. "We must go to the authorities," he said. "We must make them search the house. We must get her out of there." But Father O'Brien knew it would not be that simple. Sheriff Brennan had already investigated and found nothing amiss. The Baron had letters that appeared to be from Margherita, written in Italian in a feminine hand. Without concrete evidence of a crime, without Margherita herself testifying that she was being held against her will, no judge would issue a warrant to search the home of a wealthy and influential man based on the word of a foreign tenor and a dismissed housemaid. They needed proof, something undeniable that would force the authorities to act. Giovanni had an idea. If Margherita was indeed being held in the mansion, if she was still alive, then perhaps she could be reached. He proposed that he and Father O'Brien approach the estate at night when the Baron might be less vigilant, and try to make contact with whoever was in that locked room. It was dangerous and possibly illegal, trespassing at the very least, and perhaps breaking and entering if they tried to force their way in. But Father O'Brien, after a night of prayer and soul-searching, agreed. Some sins, he believed, were too great to ignore, even if exposing them required bending certain rules. The commandment against bearing false witness was important, but surely the commandment against allowing evil to flourish was more important still. On a moonless night in late October 1874, exactly 1 year after Margarita's last public performance, Giovanni and Father O'Brien made their way through the woods that bordered the Baron's estate. The night was cold and damp, with a mist rising from the river that made visibility poor and turned every tree into a ghostly shape. They moved slowly and carefully, trying to avoid stepping on branches that might crack and give away their presence. The mansion loomed against the dark sky, most of its windows black, but the light in the east tower burned as always, a steady beacon that seemed to mock their efforts at stealth. They circled the building, looking for a way to approach that tower without being seen from the main house. The grounds were extensive, with formal gardens and stands of trees that provided some cover, but the tower itself stood somewhat apart from the main structure, connected by a covered walkway. The tower had a single window about 20 feet above the ground, too high to reach without a ladder. But there was a large oak tree growing nearby, its branches extending toward the tower, and Giovanni thought that if he could climb the tree, he might be able to get close enough to the window to see inside and perhaps make contact with whoever was there. Father O'Brien kept watch below while Giovanni climbed the tree. The bark was rough and damp, making it difficult to get a good grip, and the branches swayed alarmingly in the wind. Giovanni was younger and more agile than the priest, but he was not accustomed to climbing trees, and he moved slowly and carefully, testing each branch before putting his full weight on it. The branch that reached closest to the window was thin and swayed alarmingly under his weight, but he managed to inch along it until he was close enough to see into the room. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The room was small and sparsely furnished, a narrow bed with a thin mattress and a single blanket, a washstand with a chipped basin and pitcher, a single wooden chair. And sitting on that chair, her back to the window, was a woman. Even from behind, Giovanni recognized his sister by her dark hair, though it was longer now and hung loose down her back, rather than being styled in the elaborate arrangements she had once favored. She was wearing a simple white dress, one of the dresses Mrs. Whitlock had made, and she appeared to be singing. He could see her shoulders moving with her breath, could see her head tilting as she reached for high notes, though he could hear nothing through the thick glass of the window. He tapped on the window, gently at first and then more insistently. Margarita stopped singing and turned slowly, as if in a dream. When she saw him, her eyes widened in shock and disbelief. For a moment she simply stared, her mouth open, her hands rising to her face as if to confirm that she was not hallucinating. Then she stood and moved toward the window, and as she did, Giovanni saw what made him nearly lose his grip on the branch and fall to the ground below. There were iron cuffs around her ankles, connected by a short chain that allowed her to walk, but not to run, not to move freely. The chain was attached to a bolt in the floor near the center of the room, giving her access to the bed, the washstand, and the chair, but preventing her from reaching the door or the window. Margarita pressed her hands against the glass, tears streaming down her face, her mouth moving as she spoke words he could not hear. She was thin, terribly, frighteningly thin, her cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin, her eyes enormous in her gaunt face. She looked like someone who had been ill for a long time, or someone who was slowly starving. Giovanni pressed his own hands against the glass, trying to communicate through gestures that he would get help, that he would return, that she should not give up hope. Margarita shook her head violently and pointed downward toward the door of her room. She was trying to tell him something urgent, her gestures becoming more frantic. She pointed to the door, then to herself, then made a gesture of someone turning a key in a lock. She was trying to warn him that someone was coming, that he needed to leave, that he was in danger. Then he heard it, the sound of a door opening below, footsteps on stairs, heavy and deliberate. Someone was coming to the tower. Margarita's face filled with terror. She gestured desperately for Giovanni to leave, to hide, her hands waving him away, even as tears continued to stream down her face. He hesitated, torn between the desire to break through the window and rescue her immediately, and the knowledge that doing so would likely get them both killed. The footsteps were getting closer, climbing the spiral staircase that led to the tower room. Giovanni retreated along the branch, moving as quickly as he dared, and dropped to the ground beside Father O'Brien. They ran into the woods and did not stop until they were well away from the estate, their hearts pounding, their breath coming in gasps. When they finally paused to rest, leaning against trees and trying to catch their breath, Giovanni told the priest what he had seen. The chains, the terror in his sister's eyes, the way she had been singing even though she was alone. Or perhaps not alone. Perhaps the Baron had been there, just out of sight, forcing her to perform for him and him alone. Now they had their evidence. Now they could go to the authorities and demand action. But when they returned to town the next morning and reported what they had seen to Sheriff Brennan, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. The sheriff believed them. He could see the genuine horror and desperation in their faces, could hear the ring of truth in their voices. But he explained that the legal situation was complicated. The Baron could claim that Margarita was staying with him voluntarily, that the chains were for her own protection because she was mentally unstable and had attempted to harm herself. He could produce doctors who would testify to her instability, could argue that he was acting as her guardian and protector, without Margarita herself testifying that she was being held against her will, without her standing before a judge and saying, "I am a prisoner, I am being held against my will, I want to leave." It would be difficult to prove kidnapping. Moreover, the Baron had powerful friends who could make life very difficult for a small-town sheriff who harassed a prominent citizen without ironclad evidence. There could be lawsuits, complaints to the governor, political pressure that could end Sheriff Brennan's career. "What I need," Sheriff Brennan said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "is for Miss Santoro to be seen by multiple witnesses in a condition that makes her captivity undeniable. Or I need the Baron to make a mistake, to do something so egregious that even his powerful friends cannot protect him. I need something that will stand up in court, something that a judge cannot dismiss or explain away." Giovanni was furious. His face flushed red and he slammed his fist on the sheriff's desk. "So we do nothing? We leave my sister in chains while we wait for this monster to make a mistake? She could die in there. She is starving. Did you not hear what I said about how thin she is?" "No," Sheriff Brennan said firmly. "We do not do nothing. We watch. We wait. And we prepare. I will deputize some men I trust. We will keep the estate under surveillance. We will document everything we see and hear. And the very moment, we have legal grounds to act, we will. But if we move too soon, if we act without proper legal authority, the Baron will walk free and your sister will be lost forever. Do you understand?" It was not the immediate rescue Giovanni had hoped for, but it was something. Over the following weeks, a careful watch was maintained on the Baron's estate. Several men, including Giovanni and Father O'Brien, took turns observing the mansion from the woods, noting the Baron's movements, the comings and goings of servants, any detail that might prove useful. They kept written records of everything they observed, noting dates and times and specific details that might be needed in court. What they observed confirmed their worst fears. The Baron rarely left the estate, and when he did, it was only for brief trips to town for supplies or to meet with his lawyer or banker. Every evening, like clockwork, he would climb the stairs to the East Tower at precisely 8 o'clock and remain there for hours, sometimes until well past midnight. Sometimes, on still nights when the wind was right, the watchers could hear music, a woman's voice, singing arias and scales, the same phrases repeated endlessly. It sounded less like practice and more like a ritual, or perhaps a compulsion, as if the Baron were forcing Margarita to sing the same pieces over and over until they achieved some standard of perfection that existed only in his mind. Mrs. Hoffman, the housekeeper, made daily trips to the tower with food and other supplies. The other servants, a cook, a gardener, and a man who served as both butler and handyman, were never allowed near it. On one occasion, one of the watchers saw Mrs. Hoffman emerge from the tower carrying a bundle of soiled linens, which she burned in the estate's incinerator rather than sending them to be laundered. This suggested that the Baron was taking extreme measures to ensure that no evidence of Margarita's presence left the estate, that no one outside the household would have any proof that she was there. Winter came early again that year, bringing snow and bitter cold that made the surveillance more difficult. The watchers had to contend with freezing temperatures and limited visibility, and there were nights when it was simply too dangerous to maintain the vigil. Giovanni grew increasingly desperate and frustrated. His sister was suffering, possibly dying, and they were powerless to help her. He began to talk about taking more direct action, breaking into the mansion, confronting the Baron, forcing a rescue even if it meant risking arrest or worse. He was willing to die, he said, if it meant saving his sister. Father O'Brien and Sheriff Brennan counseled patience, but even they were beginning to doubt their strategy. The Baron seemed untouchable, protected by wealth and influence and the thick walls of his mansion. And as the winter deepened, they all feared the same thing, that they were running out of time, that Margarita might not survive until spring, that they would find her too late. The break they needed came from an unexpected source. In January 1875, a new doctor arrived in Rhinecliff. His name was Dr. Samuel Hartwell, and he had recently completed his medical training in Boston, where he had studied under some of the most progressive physicians in the country. He was young, barely 30, idealistic, and not yet worn down by the compromises and moral ambiguities that often came with practicing medicine in a small town where the wealthy expected their secrets to be kept and their indiscretions overlooked. Dr. Hartwell was called to the Baron's estate in late January to treat Mrs. Hoffman, who had developed a severe respiratory infection that had left her bedridden with a high fever and a cough that produced blood-tinged sputum. While examining the housekeeper in her room on the ground floor, Dr. Hartwell heard something that made him pause in the middle of listening to her lungs with his stethoscope. A woman's voice, singing faintly from somewhere above. The voice was beautiful but somehow wrong, mechanical and lifeless, singing the same phrase over and over, "Sempre libera degio," always free must I be, the irony of which was not lost on the doctor once he understood the situation. He asked Mrs. Hoffman about it, and she explained, as the Baron had explained to others, that it was a music box, a mechanical device that the Baron enjoyed listening to. But Dr. Hartwell had studied music as well as medicine. He played the violin and had performed in amateur orchestras during his years at university, and he knew the difference between a mechanical reproduction and a human voice. What he heard was unmistakably human and unmistakably distressed. The voice would sing a phrase, then stop abruptly, then begin again, as if the singer were being interrupted or corrected, as if someone were standing over her demanding perfection and punishing mistakes. There was something profoundly wrong about it, something that made the doctor's skin crawl and his medical instincts scream that someone was in distress, that someone needed help. After treating Mrs. Hoffman and leaving her with instructions and medicine, Dr. Hartwell mentioned his concerns to Sheriff Brennan. who immediately brought him into the circle of those who knew the truth about Margarita. Dr. Hartwell was shocked and outraged. As a physician, he understood that Margarita's physical and mental health were likely in grave danger after more than a year of captivity. Prolonged isolation, inadequate nutrition, and psychological abuse could cause permanent damage, could kill her even if the Baron never laid a violent hand on her. He offered to help in any way he could, and Sheriff Brennan had an idea. If Dr. Hartwell, as a licensed physician, could examine Margarita and document evidence of abuse or unlawful imprisonment, that would provide the legal grounds needed for an arrest and a thorough search of the estate. The challenge was getting access to Margarita. The Baron would never voluntarily allow a doctor to examine her, would never admit that she was even there. They devised a plan. Dr. Hartwell would return to the estate, ostensibly to check on Mrs. Hoffman's recovery, but would bring with him a legal document. A public health order, hastily drafted by Judge William Hendricks, a sympathetic magistrate who had been quietly horrified by the stories he had heard about the Baron. The order required that all residents of the estate be examined for signs of the respiratory infection, which could potentially spread to the wider community if not properly contained. It was a thin pretext, and Judge Hendricks was stretching his authority to the breaking point by issuing it, but it was legal, and it would give Dr. Hartwell the authority to insist on examining everyone in the household, including anyone in the East Tower. On February 3, 1875, Dr. Hartwell returned to the Baron's estate, accompanied by Sheriff Brennan and 2 deputies. The Baron met them at the door, his face darkening when he saw the sheriff and his men. Dr. Hartwell explained the situation, the public health concern, the legal requirement for examinations, the need to ensure that the infection had not spread to other members of the household. He presented the judge's order, written on official paper and bearing the judge's seal. The Baron read the document carefully, his jaw tightening with each line. He understood that he was trapped. If he refused to comply, it would raise immediate suspicions and give the sheriff grounds to obtain a search warrant. If he complied, he would have to allow Dr. Hartwell access to Margarita. He made a calculation, perhaps believing that he could still control the situation, that Margarita was too broken or too frightened to speak the truth, that he could explain away whatever the doctor saw. "Very well," he said coldly, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "But I must insist on being present during all examinations. This is my home, and I have a right to ensure that my privacy is respected and that my guests are not subjected to unnecessary distress." They began with the servants, examining each one in turn in the kitchen. All were healthy except for Mrs. Hoffman, who was recovering as expected, her fever broken and her cough improving. The cook, the gardener, and the butler handyman all submitted to examination without complaint, though they seemed nervous and kept glancing at the Baron as if seeking permission to speak or move. Finally, there was only one person left. "I believe there is one more resident," Dr. Hartwell said carefully, his voice neutral and professional. "I heard a woman's voice when I was here last week. A woman singing. I must examine her as well." The Baron's face went rigid, all color draining from it. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That is Miss Bellini," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She is my guest. She is not ill. There is no need to examine her." "Nevertheless, I must examine her," Dr. Hartwell said firmly. "The order requires all residents. No exceptions. I'm sure you understand, Baron. This is a matter of public health." For a long moment, the Baron said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Sheriff Brennan's hand moved to his sidearm, ready for violence. The 2 deputies shifted their positions, flanking the Baron, prepared to restrain him if necessary. Then, slowly, the Baron nodded. His face had gone from white to red. and a vein throbbed visibly in his temple. "Follow me," he said, his voice hoarse. He led them up the stairs to the east tower, moving slowly, as if each step required tremendous effort. At the heavy oak door, he produced a key from his pocket, a large, ornate key that looked medieval, and unlocked it. The door swung open with a creak, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. They climbed in single file, the Baron in the lead, followed by Dr. Hartwell, then Sheriff Brennan and his deputies. The air in the stairwell was stale and smelled of something medicinal and slightly sweet. Laudanum, Dr. Hartwell realized, the opium-based tincture commonly used to treat pain and anxiety. The room at the top of the tower was exactly as Giovanni had described it. Small, sparsely furnished, with a single window that let in weak winter sunlight. And sitting on the chair, her hands folded in her lap, was Margarita Santoro. She looked up as they entered, and Dr. Hartwell had to suppress a gasp of horror. She was emaciated, her cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin stretched tight, her eyes enormous and haunted in her gaunt face. Her arms were thin as sticks, and her collarbones protruded sharply above the neckline of her dress. She looked like someone who had been starving for months, like someone who was slowly dying. The iron cuffs around her ankles were clearly visible, the chain pooled on the floor beside her like a metal snake. The skin beneath the cuffs was raw and scarred, suggesting that she had worn them for a very long time, that she had perhaps tried to remove them and had only succeeded in injuring herself. "Miss Bellini," the Baron said, his voice carefully controlled, each word precisely enunciated. "This is Dr. Hartwell. He needs to examine you. It is merely a formality, a public health matter. You will cooperate fully. You will answer his questions truthfully. Do you understand?" Margarita looked at the doctor, then at the sheriff, then back at the Baron. Something flickered in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or calculation, or simply the desperate gamble of someone who has nothing left to lose. She nodded slowly, not speaking. Dr. Hartwell approached her, his medical bag in hand, his movements slow and gentle, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt. "I need to examine you," he said gently, his voice kind. "May I?" He gestured to the chair, indicating that she should remain seated. As he knelt beside her to check her pulse, he whispered, too low for the Baron to hear, "Your brother is here, in town, Giovanni. We are going to help you, but I need you to tell me the truth. Are you here against your will?" Margarita's eyes filled with tears. Her pulse, which Dr. Hartwell was monitoring with his fingers on her wrist, suddenly accelerated. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the Baron stepped forward. "That is quite enough, Doctor. You can see that she is in perfect health. She is thin because she has been ill, but she is recovering. Now, if you are satisfied—" "I am not satisfied, Doctor," Hartwell said, standing and turning to face the Baron. His voice was shaking with barely controlled rage, all pretense of professional neutrality abandoned. "This woman is malnourished and clearly in distress. Her pulse is rapid and irregular. She shows signs of prolonged psychological trauma, and unless I am very much mistaken, those are restraints on her ankles. Sheriff, I believe you need to see this." Sheriff Brennan moved forward, his deputies flanking him, their hands on their weapons. The Baron's face went white, then red, then white again. "You have no right. This is my home. She is here voluntarily. She is mentally unstable. The restraints are for her own protection." "Is that true, Miss Santoro?" Sheriff Brennan asked, using her real name deliberately, watching her face carefully. "Are you here voluntarily? Are the restraints for your own protection?" Margarita looked at the Baron. For a moment the old fear was visible in her eyes. The fear that had kept her silent for so long, the fear of what he might do if she spoke, the fear that had been beaten into her through months of isolation and psychological abuse. But then she looked at the sheriff, at the doctor, at the deputies with their hands on their weapons, and she saw something she had not seen in more than a year. The possibility of escape, the possibility of freedom, the possibility of a life beyond this room and this chain and this man who had stolen her voice and tried to steal her soul. "No," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse except for singing, but clear and firm. "I am not here voluntarily. He has kept me prisoner. He locked me in this room. He put these chains on me. He said..." Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "He said that my voice was too beautiful to be shared with the world, that it belonged to him, that I would sing only for him until I died. He said that if I tried to escape, if I told anyone, he would kill me. He said that no one would believe me, that he was too powerful, that I was nothing, that I had no rights, that I was his property." The Baron lunged toward her with a roar of rage, his hands reaching for her throat, but the deputies were faster. They grabbed his arms and pulled him back, wrestling him to the ground as he struggled and shouted. "She is mine," he screamed, his voice breaking, all pretense of civilized behavior abandoned. "Her voice is mine. I saved her from obscurity. I gave her everything. She owes me. She owes me her voice. She owes me her life." "You own nothing," Sheriff Brennan said coldly, standing over the Baron as the deputies restrained him. "Baron Heinrich von Strauss, I am arresting you for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and assault. You will be held in custody pending trial." As the deputies restrained the Baron and began to lead him from the room, he continued to shout, his words becoming increasingly incoherent, a mixture of German and English, declarations of love and ownership and rage. He was not a man anymore, but something else, something broken and twisted, his obsession finally exposed to the light. Dr. Hartwell knelt beside Margarita and examined the cuffs around her ankles. They had been locked on for so long that the skin beneath them was raw and scarred, infected in places. He would need tools to remove them safely, and he would need to treat the infections before they spread. "Can you walk?" he asked gently. Margarita nodded. "He would let me walk around the room," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For exercise, so my voice would stay strong. He made me sing for him every night, for hours, the same arias over and over. If I made a mistake, if my voice cracked, he would..." She stopped, unable to continue, her whole body shaking. "You don't have to explain now," Dr. Hartwell said softly. "You're safe. We're going to take you out of here. We're going to take care of you." They helped her down the narrow staircase, the chain between her ankles making each step difficult and painful. When they emerged from the tower into the main house, Mrs. Hoffman was waiting in the hallway, her face pale and drawn. She looked at Margarita, then at the sheriff, and her face crumpled. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she spoke, her words tumbling out in a mixture of German and English. "I am sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I am so sorry. I knew it was wrong, but he paid me so much money, and he said she was willing, that it was an arrangement they had made, that she was being difficult, but would come to accept it. I did not know. I did not want to know. I told myself it was not my business, that I was just following orders, but I knew. Deep down, I knew, and I did nothing. I am so sorry." "You will have to answer for your part in this," Sheriff Brennan said grimly. "You aided and abetted a serious crime. You will be charged as an accessory." They took Margarita to Dr. Hartwell's office, where he carefully removed the iron cuffs using special tools, working slowly and gently to avoid causing more damage to her already injured ankles. He cleaned and bandaged the wounds, gave her medicine for the pain and the infections, and examined her thoroughly. She was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and showed signs of prolonged psychological trauma. She would need weeks, perhaps months, of care to recover physically, and the psychological scars might never fully heal. Giovanni, who had been waiting anxiously in town, was brought to see her. The reunion between brother and sister was emotional and private, but those who saw them emerge from the doctor's office later said that Margarita looked more alive than she had in months, despite her physical condition. She clung to her brother, sobbing, and he held her, whispering reassurances in Italian, promising that he would never let anyone hurt her again, that he would take her home, that she would be safe. The Baron was held in the town's small jail while formal charges were prepared. He refused to speak to anyone except to repeat over and over that Margarita belonged to him, that her voice was his, that they had no right to take her away. A lawyer arrived from New York City, hired by the Baron's business associates, and attempted to argue that the situation was a misunderstanding, that Margarita had been mentally unstable and the restraints were for her own protection, that the Baron had been acting as her guardian and caretaker out of concern for her welfare. But Margarita's testimony, supported by Dr. Hartwell's medical examination and the statements of Emma Kowalski and others, made it clear that this was a case of kidnapping and false imprisonment. The physical evidence, the chains, the locked door, the conditions in which she had been kept, was undeniable. Moreover, Giovanni was able to prove that the letters supposedly from Margarita were forgeries. The handwriting was similar but not identical to his sister's, and the content contained errors that Margarita would never have made. References to places she had never been, people she had never met, events that had never occurred. The trial, when it finally occurred in the spring of 1875, was a sensation. Newspapers from New York City and beyond sent reporters to cover it, and the courtroom was packed every day with spectators eager to hear the sordid details. The story had everything that appealed to the public imagination: a beautiful singer, a wealthy villain, a dramatic rescue, themes of obsession and possession, and the abuse of power. The details that emerged during the trial were shocking, even to those who thought they knew the full story. The Baron, it was revealed, had become obsessed with Margarita's voice after hearing her perform in Naples. He had attended every performance, had followed her from city to city, had collected programs and reviews and anything else related to her. He had convinced himself that he alone truly understood and appreciated her talent, that other audiences were unworthy of hearing her sing, that her voice was too precious to be wasted on the masses. He had convinced her to come to America with promises of fame and fortune, but from the beginning, his intentions had been possessive rather than professional. He had wanted her voice for himself alone, had been jealous of every person who heard her sing, had resented sharing her talent with audiences. The public performances at his estate had been a compromise, a way of showing off his possession while still maintaining control. After the last public performance in October 1873, when her voice had cracked on that high note, he had flown into a rage. He had accused her of not taking her training seriously, of wasting her gift, of being ungrateful for everything he had done for her. He had locked her in the tower room, initially as punishment, but then the arrangement had become permanent. He had convinced himself that this was for her own good, that the world was not worthy of her voice, that only he truly appreciated her talent, that he was protecting her from exploitation and corruption. He had forced her to sing for him every evening, correcting her technique, demanding perfection, treating her as a living instrument rather than a human being. He had controlled every aspect of her life: what she ate, what she wore, when she slept, when she practiced. He had isolated her completely, cutting off all contact with the outside world, making her dependent on him for everything. The chains had been added after Margarita had attempted to escape through the window in early 1874. She had nearly succeeded in climbing down, using bedsheets tied together, but the Baron had discovered her halfway down and had pulled her back up. After that, he had installed the restraints to prevent any future attempts. He had told her that if she tried to escape again, he would kill her, and she had believed him. Mrs. Hoffman testified reluctantly, admitting her role in the crime. She had brought food and supplies to the tower, had maintained the fiction that Margherita had returned to Italy, had helped the Baron forge the letters supposedly from Margherita. She had done all this in exchange for generous payment and the Baron's assurance that the arrangement was consensual, that Margherita was being difficult but would eventually accept the situation. She claimed that she had not known the full extent of the Baron's abuse, but it was clear that she had chosen not to ask too many questions, had chosen to believe what was convenient rather than what was true. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. The Baron was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a harsh sentence for the time, reflecting the jury's horror at what he had done. His estate was seized to pay restitution to Margherita and to cover the costs of the trial. Mrs. Hoffman was sentenced to 3 years for her role in the crime, a relatively light sentence given her cooperation and her testimony against the Baron. Margherita remained in Rhinecliff for several months, recovering her health under Dr. Hartwell's care. Giovanni stayed with her, renting a small room above a shop in town and taking whatever work he could find to support them both. Slowly, with time and support and proper nutrition, she began to heal. The physical scars faded, though the ones on her ankles would remain for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder of her ordeal. The psychological scars took longer. For weeks, she could not bring herself to sing. The act that had once brought her joy had become associated with captivity and fear and abuse. The thought of opening her mouth and producing sound made her feel physically ill. But Father O'Brien, who visited her regularly, encouraged her gently. "Your voice is yours," he told her. "It was always yours. He tried to steal it, but he failed. Don't let him take it from you now. Don't let him win." In June 1875, Margherita sang in public for the first time since her rescue. It was a small gathering at Father O'Brien's church, just a few dozen people who had supported her during her ordeal. The sheriff and his wife, Dr. Hartwell, Emma Kowalski and her family, Judge Hendricks, and others who had helped in various ways. She sang Ave Maria, her voice tentative at first, shaking with emotion and fear, then growing stronger as she realized that she was safe, that no one was going to hurt her, that she was singing because she chose to, not because someone was forcing her. When she finished, there was not a dry eye in the church. Her voice had changed. It was deeper now, with a quality of sorrow and resilience that had not been there before, a darkness that came from having suffered and survived. But it was still extraordinary, still capable of moving people to tears, still capable of expressing emotions that words alone could not convey. She had reclaimed her voice, had taken back what the Baron had tried to steal. Margherita and Giovanni returned to Italy in the autumn of 1875, sailing from New York City on a ship bound for Naples. She never performed professionally again, though those who knew her said she sang often in her home, for her family and friends, reclaiming her voice on her own terms. She married a few years later, a kind man, a teacher, someone who loved her for herself and not for her voice, and had children. She lived a long and, by most accounts, happy life, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1923 at the age of 72. The Baron died in prison in 1882, 7 years into his sentence. He had been a difficult prisoner, refusing to work, refusing to eat, spending his days in his cell muttering to himself. He never expressed remorse for his actions, never acknowledged that what he had done was wrong. Until the end, he maintained that Margherita's voice had belonged to him, that he had been protecting it from a world that would not have appreciated it properly, that he had been the victim of a miscarriage of justice. His estate, including the mansion on the Hudson, was eventually sold at auction. The new owners renovated extensively, tearing down the East Tower and building a new wing in its place. But they reported that on certain nights, when the wind was right and the moon was full, they could still hear music coming from where the tower had once stood. A woman's voice, singing arias from Verdi, beautiful and sad and free at last. This mystery shows us how obsession can transform admiration into imprisonment, how the desire to possess beauty can destroy it, how power and wealth can be used to trap and control those who are vulnerable. It reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary people who convince themselves that their desires justify any cruelty, that their obsessions excuse any crime. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this,
Subscribe to Circle of Fire 1.
hit the notification bell and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.